Hello everyone, welcome back to CS with Mr. G, and welcome to another lesson within the Unit 8 programming unit of iGCSE Computer Science, where in this lesson we're going to look at this term maintainable programming, which is a nice easy lesson and covers many common programming practices which we've covered so far. But what we need to do is highlight and specifically mention what's going on when we program, which you will recognize some of the stuff I've done naturally up until now. But this term maintainable simply refers to writing our code to make sure that it's one, readable, not just by you, but by other people as well. And two, written in a way which maximizes efficiency, readability, and just generally how the program functions. So these three things in particular we're going to look at: the term meaningful identifiers, which basically means variables, arrays, and functions, and giving them meaningful names. Commenting on our code, so how we write comments on the code, and what kind of things you would write in a comment, and something that's been covered quite recently, which is the use of procedures and functions. So firstly, let's look at why we need to create a program that is what we consider maintainable. And what we need to think about is that when a program is written to the point of completion, or to a point where we are happy with our programs, we need to think that who else is going to look at this code later on in the future? Will there be other programmers involved? Will there be changes that need making? Might it need fixing in the future? All of these things we have to think about so that when we come back to the code, if there's anything that we've forgotten in terms of how it works or things that are being stored and we're not quite sure what's inside, then these three things are going to help us in the future when we need to revisit the code, or like I've said, somebody else needs to read the code. So this term meaningful identifiers, this is something that I've naturally done up until now. Anytime we've written code in our lessons, both pseudocode and Python, I've always given the variables a name in which describes what's being stored. Now, what's important is that we realize it's not just variables that are given names. We've also got this term constants, which is essentially a variable that doesn't change. We've also got arrays, functions, and procedures. These are all given names by the programmer and referred to in different lines of code within the program. So giving them a name which makes sense and describes what's inside is a good practice, and like I've said, is something that we've done up until now. But in terms of the paper 2 exam, just helps us create what we call a maintainable program, like in the name of this lesson. So some examples, we've got a total price variable is much more informative than if we just called it TP. Although there and then in the moment of writing a code, if we know that a variable is storing the total price of something, we might call it TP, because there and then we know what TP stands for, and it saves us a bit of time as opposed to writing total price. But coming back to the code in the future or giving the code to another programmer, TP might sound very confusing and does not label what's inside that variable. Another example, which could be for a function or a procedure, we've got calculate average salary, which pretty much tells you that this function is going to calculate the average salary as opposed to calc iGCSE, which, like the previous example, in that moment when you write it makes perfect sense. We know that calc is short for calculate, average is average, and SA is short for salary. But give this program to somebody else who has no idea what's going on, and things could start to get tricky. So meaningful identifiers means giving it a clear name which describes what's being stored inside the variable, array, or function. Some more examples, we've got A, B, C here. A represents the number of apples, B represents the number of oranges, and then C represents the total of apples and oranges. So rather than call them A, B, and C, it would make much more sense to give them proper names, like in the example here. Now, what you will find in the exam, guys, is not just giving your code meaningful identifiers, but when you're having to read pseudocode given to you by the exam, questions do come up that will state, give the variable in this code a more meaningful identifier. If there's a total algorithm in the code given to you that's represented by the letter T, a question could follow saying give a more meaningful name for this identifier. And if it was something like T becomes T plus price, you would say a better example would be total becomes total plus price. So this is just one example, guys, and we will see many of these examples when we practice past paper questions. But for now, meaningful identifiers is pretty self-explanatory, and hopefully you can understand what's going on. Commenting on code is even more self-explanatory, and in my lessons up until now, you will have seen code that's been commented on using a hashtag. So this hash symbol is used in Python, and anything that follows a hashtag in Python will not be run when the program is executed. It would simply be disregarded and Python gets rid of it. As you can see, this one's grayed out. There's no colors involved, but anything that follows a hashtag in Python will simply be disregarded by Python when it's run. Now, this is really useful when working as part of a team because you can explain what's going on in certain parts of your program using this feature, and again, just helps with your readability of the program in case you need to come back to it or pass it to somebody else. And finally, procedures and functions, which we've recently looked at. Procedures and functions are blocks of code that perform a specific task within a bigger program, but helps make our programs more modular, which is a term we've come across before. And by doing this, it just overall helps the code become more readable. Functions and procedures themselves are reusable. So rather than duplicate code or unnecessarily write code more than once, we can just call upon these functions and procedures. And this term modularity, which I've just mentioned, breaking the code into smaller pieces, just makes the program more manageable and certainly makes it easier to test and debug. So we can specifically test individual functions and procedures to make sure they work. And if you've checked it once and it works, and you call it many times, you only need to test it that one time and it will be usable across the whole program. And that ties into the bottom point, ease of testing. The smaller we make our subtasks or the more we decompose our problems, we can test each of these individually, which just helps overall testing and, like I've mentioned, debugging the programs more efficiently. So the use of procedures and functions helps with creating a maintainable program. And that's what I'm talking about when I include it in the term maintainable programming. So just to finish off, guys, let's explain what these terms mean and remind ourselves that these three terms cover what we call maintainable programming. And as we've said, meaningful identifiers just helps with readability, making code easier to understand. We help reduce errors, giving variables descriptive names, which will help prevent mistakes. And of course, future maintenance just helps us remember what's inside things being stored so we can understand the code at a later date. Commenting code explains what's happening in the code. It can explain why we've done a certain thing within the code. It will help when you work within a team, so you can help other people understand what's going on, or they can help you. And of course, if changes are made to the code in future updates or even bug fixes, we can help explain what that change was using a comment. And finally, that term modularity when it comes to procedures and functions, which allows code to be reused and becomes more modular, and of course, makes it easier to test and debug. So remember, guys, these are the kind of questions in the paper 2 exam where you're not required to code. So if you aren't confident in the pseudocode questions or the algorithms, these are the marks that you want to be getting in paper 2, as it's just a case of remembering keywords and revising the topics that surround the problem solving aspects, which is what we want to do to maximize our marks in the paper 2 exam. So as always, guys, I hope that's clear. I hope you've managed to understand. There are a couple of lessons left in Unit 8 where we will look at arrays and how we store information in an array, and also reading and writing from a text file, which will conclude the Unit 8, which has been quite a large unit, but one of the most important ones when it comes to that paper 2 exam. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video.